I actually think that Stella could probably report that I am, maybe one thing that makes me stand out is I'm the candidate who sticks to the allowed time. So I will try to do that here for you. Look, I ran for Congress because I believe that Washington is badly broken, that there is too much focus on the agenda of big corporations and not enough attention to the problems facing ordinary Californians. And so I think it's important that we shake up the status quo, that we recognize that trust in Congress is at an all-time low, and that it's not just about pointing the finger at extremist Republican policies. It's also about being willing to improve our institution, improve our democracy, and that includes things like banning congressional stock trading, banning federal lobbyist donations, abolishing the filibuster, restructuring our committees to actually reflect, I don't know, today's economy, maybe the economy of the last 50 years. I'm a single working mom raising my 3 kids right here in California. And so I'm very, very invested in California's future. And I'm really thinking about this race this way. What has Washington failed to do and left us behind on? Things that we have to dig our way out of, like a bad housing crisis, inaction on climate. And where do we need as Californians to push to get ahead, addressing issues that are a big part of our economy, like AI. And so I'm excited to be in conversation with you. And I think this is an amazing opportunity for Californians to talk about why Washington isn't serving us and how our next senator can change that.
Great. So I will start us out by, asking you some questions regarding economy and jobs. So first off, the federal minimum wage, you have advocated for a $20 rate with $25 for California workers indexed to inflation. So realistically, will it be signed into law during your Senate tenure, and how would you get it done?
Yeah. So look, workers create the value in our economy. And I think we have lost sight of that in the last 30 years. I think that's a real perversion, actually, of capitalism. And I think it's really important that Democrats talk about how do you have a strong, stable, globally competitive economy? What has made the American economy resilient and amazing and remarkable? And it is because we have created opportunities for workers and working people and for the middle class. And so to get there, you have to let workers make ends meet and be able to save a little bit for a secure retirement, to be able to put their kids through college, to be able to continue working because the costs of childcare don't push them out of the workforce. So I think we need to reset this whole idea about kind of who capitalism serves. We as lawmakers, and this is state law, not federal, but there are lots of ways in which the federal tax code, securities laws reinforce this. We give corporations a lot of preferential treatment. And in return for that, they are supposed to generate that strong, stable economy. If they are not doing that by not paying their workers enough, by not sharing the value that the workers are creating, by not investing in research and development, but instead favoring short-term profits for their shareholders, then we have to be willing to tackle that. Look, Republicans have been very, very resistant on the minimum wage, and frankly, so have some Democrats. I think this is a good example of an issue where every Democrat has the same talking point, but not every Democrat is really in the fight to put this on the House floor. And so I do think that, minimum wages are different than what I think is really the most important issue, which is how most people are doing, right? So minimum wages by definition are supposed to be kind of for entry level, for younger people, but that's not true today. The majority of people earning minimum wage are full-time workers, and they are disproportionately women and women of color. So we cannot have a just society as well as a thriving economy if we don't tackle this issue head on. And the American people agree with us. And so we have to make this case affirmatively to put that pressure on Republicans to get this done.
Yeah, Congresswoman, you talked a lot about, why it is important, right, for the minimum wage to serve the workers, but how exactly would be what would be your approach to get it done in the Senate?
Yeah, so look, legislatively, this isn't complicated, Stella. It's strike 7 and 750 and put in 20. So this is about political will. That's why I'm focusing on what the argument is. We have too many Democrats who are not comfortable talking about the economy, who aren't willing to say things like, we should expect tax fairness, right? We should expect to make sure that we can live on. We should tackle things like stock buybacks, stock buybacks is a great example. 30, 40, 50 years ago, stock buybacks were illegal. And when I said this to someone on the House floor the other day, they said, no, that can't be right. Because it's almost become unimaginable in one decade that you could really think about, why do we give corporations all these things? And so I do think this is primarily about building the political will in the United States across party lines, because we need Republican voters, independent voters, and Democratic voters all pressing on this. And that, Stella, still doesn't mean it will be easy. Look, we know that all voters of all political parties support gun violence prevention, yet Congress hasn't gotten it done. And this issue will be in some ways even harder, because corporate America will literally spend hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, aggregating maybe even to $1 billion or more, to try to block this legislation. So you're not going to probably get this over the finish line until we elect people who don't take corporate PAC money, and until we make that the norm, the expectation for our elected leaders.
Thank you, Congresswoman. We will actually get to the corporate PAC later. So sticking with economy and jobs, you talked a lot about tackling, price hikes, right? Corporate greed. So when are these anti-price gouging laws too much interference in the free market?
Yep. So look, price gouging is a perversion of the free market. Let's be very clear about this. It's a sign that the market is broken. So again, I'm a capitalist. I believe in markets, but part of that means that I have a duty to point out when we actually don't have a functional market. Healthcare is a great example. Pharmaceutical prices, a great example. When Congress acted to ban Medicare, the largest actor in the healthcare system, from negotiating drug prices, they guaranteed that we couldn't rely on normal market forces like the price negotiation to be able to set prices. And that's why we saw the price gouging that we have. Patents are important because they can stimulate invention, but they also are, in a way, a perversion of the normal market because they restrict competition. They do that to encourage people to invent things. But when you have patent protection, you also have to be sensitive to the fact that that can lead to price gouging. So what I would say is, when we're trying to decide whether we need to create an intervention or not, we ought to be looking at whether or not there's a real robust market that allows for competition. If there is, we will see prices naturally come down. When there isn't, we'll see price gouging. We have to do two things. We can either tackle the price gouging directly, which is what my bill does with regard to big pharma, or which is signed into law by President Trump, actually, or we can create the conditions for a more competitive marketplace. And look, Americans get this. I've said this to thousands at this point of California voters. It's very hard to think of an industry today in which there isn't monopoly pressure and monopoly power. It used to be a handful of industries, airlines, right? Now it's virtually every industry. We have a bread monopoly in this country. 40% of our bread is produced by one producer. We have a pasta monopoly, a cereal monopoly, right? And so book publishing, like I could go on and on. And so one of the things I'm really excited about with President Biden that I think he needs to campaign on more is his effort to kind of address some of these antitrust laws, to enforce them, and because that will allow our small businesses, our medium-sized businesses, to actually grow and be able to create good, high-paying jobs.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Let's move on to, campaign finance and ethics. So, you've talked about overturning Citizens United, but how practical is that plan, considering that the constitutional amendments invented to do that have gone nowhere, and the U.S. Supreme Court has deemed it a violation of the First Amendment if you overturn it? Yeah.
So look, I think that one of the things that sets me apart in this race, unlike some of my colleagues, is I'm not relying on just the Constitution, and I'm not hiding behind it. We can change how we do things. We can go beyond the Constitution. We're not limited. We're not forced to do the sort of lowest common denominator possible on campaign finance. I ran in 2018 part of a group of people who were willing to shake up how Washington does business, who did not take corporate PAC money right from the start. And when I got to Washington, I had a lobbyist tell me, "We'll break you. You'll see you won't be able to run for re-election and have the resources you need without us." And that is not true. I built a grassroots army. I am so grateful for everyone who has chipped in. And I had the most expensive House race last cycle, and I was the highest fundraiser in the Democratic caucus, period. Higher even than Speaker Pelosi. And I did it without taking corporate PAC money, without taking federal lobbyist donations. So we can do this, but it's about a norm change as well as about pressing for the legal changes to be able to do it. So look, the Supreme Court in many, many, many ways right now is corrupt. I think that Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's work on this is so important. It's the way we need to talk about the court is to explain how it has been corrupted by dark money, and by dark money that is directly tied to large corporations. And that shapes the cases the Supreme Court takes, and that shapes the outcomes of that they rule upon. So in the absence and as we work to try to reform the court, which I strongly support, we need to change our conduct. We need to change voters' expectations, and we need to have that conversation. And I think you're seeing this where candidates didn't take corporate PAC money. That is becoming the expectation in those communities, but it hasn't taken hold across the state yet. For example, most all of my California colleagues, minus maybe 3 or 4 in the entire delegation, take corporate PAC money. And so I think there's a norm thing that we can change, and we can't just hide behind the sort of lowest restrictions of the court here. We need to make the change that we want to see in the world happen.
So yeah, so you're talking about, changing, rooting out that corporate influence, right? Yet, experts that, we've talked to have said that corporate PAC is a slice of the pie. It's just a small portion of the story. You still see corporate CEOs giving. You still see trade association PACs, membership organization PACs giving, right? I know that you've sworn off some of those industries, the individual donations, but will you reject anything beyond that? And if not, why not?
Well, so one of the things that sets me apart is I don't take federal lobbyist donations. And that is really important. People understand that lobbyists at their best are supposed to give information, are supposed to educate law members. At their worst, they buy votes. And look, I've seen this night after night in Washington when we walk off the House floor after taking a vote. My colleagues head to a reception to sip bad Chardonnay and eat cheese cubes and collect cash, both from corporate PACs and from federal lobbyists. And so you're absolutely right that we need to continue to think about how do we demonstrate to voters that we work for them. Not taking federal lobbyist donations is a big one. And Stella, as you know, I don't take money from executives at big pharma, big banks, and big oil. And the reason I picked those are the 3 that I have very concretely seen in my life as a consumer advocate for years before Congress and here in Washington that have the biggest and most harmful influence on our policies. And I've put real definitions behind how do I define big pharma? How do I define big oil? How do I define big banks so that I can set a clear standard of expectation?
Thank you. And last question from me before I hand it off to my colleagues. You've talked a lot about earmark funding, right? What about earmark funding breeds corruption, and how else do you address your needs from your district, right? Your constituents that may require some federal funding?
Absolutely. So let me illustrate by way of an example. Earmarks allow an individual member to pick and choose who ought to get federal tax dollars. Imagine that a politician receives 2 project requests, both for after-school funding for a Boys and Girls Club. We would all agree, I would certainly say as a mom, a great cause. One of them is from a very small, very conservative city where the mayor last cycle ran against that congressperson. The other from a large democratic city where the entire council is friendly, where that Congress member lives. They both request money for their Boys and Girls Club. Who do you think gets it? Second example, bridges, 2 proposals to fix bridges. Both proposals say this bridge is dangerous. This is overloaded. This is crumbling. It needs repair. Does anybody think that Congress should substitute its judgment for a structural engineer in knowing which bridge is actually more in danger of crumbling? So that's how they invite corruption. And it's not just that they invite it, Stella, they actually have produced it. Even in this new supposed improved earmark regime, we have already seen Congress members directing earmark funding to nonprofits where their spouses work. And that undermines trust in government and makes people question whether these earmarks are going to the most needy or whether they are going to entities that politicians favor or benefit from. And my opponents in this race have a long history of taking earmarks. Representative Schiff has taken earmarks, gotten earmarks for his corporate donors. And he has refused to disclose years and years of earmarks, so we can't even see the extent of that problem. But based on what we know that he has done that, and that weakens trust in government. Now, we all want and should want a warrior in Washington who is going to get California its share of funding. But earmarks are a bad vehicle for doing that. Not only do they have these inherent conflicts of interest, not only do they invite politicians to substitute their personal gain for the actual judgment of need from experts, but in the Senate, there will be 2 senators from California. That's the deal. We are 1/50th, 2% of the Senate, and we are 12% of this nation's population. We already see with the existing earmark regime that the biggest amounts of earmarks go to rural states and they go to Republican states. So we are getting shortchanged today in the United States Senate, in which Alabama, not just per capita, raw, hard-earned tax dollars, Alabama got millions and millions of dollars more than California. That's not a system that is serving us well.
Yeah, sorry, real quick, but how would you, address the constituent needs, say that there is a project that needs federal funding?
Actually, I'm so glad you asked me because I was going to tell you I needed to add to my answer. I have a track record already of fighting for and winning to get projects headquartered in California. So for example, I testify at member days when committees of jurisdiction, for example, the water subcommittee had a recent member hearing, and I went and talked about the amazing infrastructure projects that we've done in Orange County, the world's largest water recycling plant that was built by tax dollars, and advocated for projects for the LA River Basin and others that are important. So those member days are the traditional way to help the committee understand where they need to be focusing resources. I've also supported grant applications for my communities who have been applying for things, and I was instrumental in helping to bring home the $1.2 billion grant for California's hydrogen hub for clean hydrogen, which is estimated to create over 200,000 high-paying jobs, focusing on really hard to electrify sectors. So you can definitely be an influence and help with resources, but you want to do it in a way that serves the biggest needs of California and is right-sized to our population and our challenges. Oh, one more example. I'm really passionate about this. Because I really am a warrior for California. The Clean School Bus Program, which is an amazing program to help prevent idling vehicles and emissions right on our playgrounds. The Clean School Bus Program has a rider in it that prevents California from getting prevents any state, but it's targeting California, from getting more than 10% of the resources. What a bunch of malarkey. We are 12% of the population, and more importantly, we are the lowest bused state in the entire union. Recently, Mississippi got ahead of us. So that's a great example of how we need to write legislation with someone who is really paying attention to California's needs and making sure that we are not just in some cases getting what's proportional to our population. There are instances like the Clean School Bus Program where we need more. Climate resilience, wildfire. Our needs there go beyond what even our population would suggest, and we'll never get that in the Senate from earmarks.
Thank you, Congresswoman. Now, for the sake of the time, let's move along. I believe Jeannie is next.
Hi. Yeah, I'm here to ask you a couple questions about the labor movement. Obviously, a big year of activity last year here in California for that. You mentioned before your support for offering striking workers unemployment benefits, a bill that Gavin Newsom vetoed here last year. I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on, we all know who pays for unemployment insurance. Is this something that employers should have to pay into to offer to striking workers? Is this something that, who should bear the cost for such a policy?
Yeah, I mean, the reality about unemployment insurance is that it's not just paid for by employers, it's shared. It's a shared cost by workers and employers. Both of them pay into it. And most of the time, when workers find themselves unemployed, in order to even qualify for unemployment insurance, they're there because of a decision that a company made, that is terminating their job. So we already have a system in which workers pay in order to get benefits when their company terminates them. So I think you can turn that on the head and say, well, okay, that seems like workers are paying for the ability for companies to let them go. So in a way, I think it makes sense that we would cover striking workers. That would be a decision by the worker to be out of the workforce, but they would have paid into that system as well.
Okay, and then outside of that, we know that support for labor unions has swelled in recent years, while union membership itself has declined to historic lows. You have, supported the PRO Act. As a senator, what would be your path, your strategy for actually moving that forward? And do you think there are other ways to kind of increase workers' power, workers' representation on the job?
Yep. So I'm going to tie the lack of progress on the PRO Act is not a coincidence. Democrats had the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and we didn't. And we have the very, very pro-labor president, President Biden. We didn't get it over the finish line, and that again takes me right back to corporate control of what Washington is doing and what votes people are willing to take. There are things that we can do in the interim. First, members can use their bully pulpit, use their voice to stand powerfully with unions. I have done that time and time again, and I was incredibly proud to be the sort of first and strongest member standing with UAW as they organized student researchers and became the biggest, newest union in the country last year. And that was a work that I'm really, really proud of, and it demonstrates my commitment to making sure that every worker has the ability to join a union if they want, and that there's a union available. Second, beyond legislation, look, I drive a minivan with a license plate OVRSITE, oversight. We need to do it of the NLRB. We need to do it at the Department of Labor, and we need to make sure that they are enforcing the existing labor laws. And we are not always doing that. A great example of this is the Department of Labor is in charge of making sure that employer-sponsored health plans are following the law. And yet, we all know that those employer-sponsored health plans often provide little or no meaningful mental health coverage, despite a law that for 11 years has said that there should be mental health parity. So I had the Department of Labor Assistant Secretary out in my district to hear stories about this problem and connected her directly to people, including providers, mental health providers, who can sort of alert her to when we're seeing insurance companies dodge their obligation. So reforming growing the NLRB, making sure that it's functional, making sure that we're pushing the Department of Labor that they're fully enforcing laws, and then pushing for things that allow workers to have the ability to organize, not just directly around labor law, but also that keep workers safe in their workplace. If you're in danger from heat, from not getting rest breaks, all of these kinds of things, from wage theft, from discrimination in the workplace, from sexual harassment in the workplace, all of these conditions also hold back workers from being able to organize, because they are all forms of keeping workers from being able to speak up and to push back and to get what they should get, which is the law being followed by employers.
But I guess is what you're saying that the reason it hasn't moved forward, that not enough of your fellow members of the majority have been using the bully pulpit enough to push for it? That's the reason?
Well, in the case of the PRO Act particularly, this bill passed the House of Representatives. It died in the Senate. And so it is really Exhibit A in many ways for why we need to shake up the Senate, why we need to elect senators who are not beholden to big corporations, and why we need to abolish the filibuster. Because what happened with that bill being killed in many ways was politicians who did not want to take a vote against their own constituents, against workers. So they hid behind the filibuster to avoid having to vote up or down on where they stand.
Thanks for that. And we're going to move on also to homelessness, another big issue here in California. Do you support Governor Gavin Newsom's mental health measure that's on the ballot this fall, Proposition 1?
So look, there is no doubt that we need to surge resources to address homelessness. And that means understanding that people need housing, not just care. They need housing as well as mental health care. And so I think that this is an important challenge. I think the care courts raise some of the exact same issues. What I see with both of those, with Prop 1 and with the care court proposal, and the pilots that are going on, is really efforts to pit those who are trying to help people experiencing homelessness and prevent homelessness against each other, because they're being put in this fight for resources. Here would be my approach. We must start focusing on reducing the number of people who are homeless in the first place. We are spending billions of dollars, and we have some amazing, talented, and committed elected officials on this issue, from Mayor Bass to the governor, who have made this a top priority. And we are spending. But for every person that gets services, whether it's through a care court, because they're ordered to, whether it's voluntarily through some of the amazing programs that we have, and they get into permanent supportive housing, more families are experiencing homelessness because housing costs keep going up, and they are going up much, much faster to wages. So one of the things I would say is I think we need to stop looking backwards at this problem and start looking forwards. So interventions like very small dollar programs to help people catch up on their rent or avoid eviction are multiple times cheaper than trying to deal with what we're doing. And so I do think that we have to have more resources for housing. But to be clear, the governor and the state of California are in the position of having to evaluate Prop 1 because the federal government has failed to do its part on housing for 80 years. That's the last time the federal government made a big, big investment in private market housing.
How are you voting on Prop 1? Are you voting yes or no?
I will probably vote yes on Prop 1. But I will tell you, as a champion on mental health, and as someone who has time and time again fought to deliver mental health services, this is not a virtuous cycle, right? Pitting people against each other and suggesting that it's an either or is, I think, a situation that we have been forced into in California because we haven't had the right partners at the federal level on this issue, and we haven't always been willing to hold big insurance companies to account for mental health care. And I'm really committed to doing that. One of my other mental health priorities that I think fits well into kind of why we need to have this more resources is we have a huge gap between the two models of mental health care that dominate, which are hospitalization, often for 72-hour holds, very, very, very expensive and hard to get, shortage of availability of beds. And I've seen that firsthand in my community. And then this kind of, if in the case of Kaiser, once a month therapy, right? And so we need to have more programs that do things that are partial hospitalization, that are intensive outpatient programs that help prevent people from getting to the point of sort of acute need where they need that inpatient. And then we have to prevent homelessness. We know more and more that experiencing homelessness, particularly street homelessness, but even living in a car, living in overcrowded conditions, not having enough to make ends meet, to feed yourself, to take care of your kids, all of those things are incredible stressors that themselves feed mental illness.
I'm sorry, I do need to go back and correct myself. It's on the ballot in March. But thanks for telling us how you plan on voting on it. The other big issue within homelessness policy right now is what to do when people are on the streets. Do you think cities should have the authority to clear homeless camps for public safety and health reasons, even if there isn't housing available for the displaced residents?
This is an excruciating choice that communities are facing. I think this is where the care court approach can be helpful because we can use that to really see where the need is and what the problem really is. I guess I would say that I sometimes think that there is a belief by elected leaders that there are all these alternatives available that is not actually mirror the reality of people trying to get housing and get housed on the ground. And so I do think there needs to be an ability for communities to keep areas safe, particularly traffic intersections, areas where playgrounds, areas where we need to make sure that people can come and to play or to move, get to their jobs safely. At the same time, I would really want some kind of protection and oversight of whether or not there is a sort of, they say that there's housing available, or what alternatives are really there. So for example, if you say that you have housing, but you don't have any housing for people with pets and someone has a pet, that's not a meaningful choice for them. They're not going to allow their pet to die or go to a shelter. If you say you have housing for people, but you separate teenage boys from their mother and their family and you break up their family unit, that's not a meaningful alternative for people. So I talked to local leaders about this. I think this is a really tough one, but I think that the solution here in part is to make sure we have the right kinds of alternative housing and that we're doing outreach early to get people connected to housing before they're in long-term street living situations, because those are the most difficult situations to get people rehoused.
Thank you. I'm going to jump in and shift us a bit to the global scale, which, for Californians as a member of Congress, that's one of the arenas where you would really represent Californians on a global level. So do you support the $95 billion aid package to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan that was approved by the Senate this week?
If that package came to the House floor, I would vote yes. I don't think it's perfect, but I think it is strong. And I think it is very, very important that the United States stand up for freedom, for democracy, for human rights, and that I believe we do need to be providing aid to Ukraine. I think it's important that that package also contains humanitarian and civilian aid for those in Gaza, particularly as that crisis is getting worse and worse. And so that the PRC and that China are adversaries of the United States, and so that it's important that we put our kind of dollars where our values are here, and that the reality is that supporting democracy abroad keeps our democracy safe and strong here at home.
Well, so you've talked about, oversight when it comes to national policies, but I'm wondering, do you support withholding military aid from Israel until a permanent ceasefire is in place in Gaza, or, if until there is some kind of conditions that are met to protect civilian lives?
Yeah. So I have said over and over again that there can never be unconditional aid, that any aid we give has to come with the expectation and the robust enforcement of actually following laws of armed conflict, laws that pertain to human rights, including the Leahy Law, and to the extent that there should not be any exception to that. And so I don't know that this is the right moment to begin to condition aid formally. But I do think this is the right moment to be forceful about making sure that we are actually holding all of our allies to account, no matter how righteous their cause is, like trying to free hostages that were taken by terror. We need to hold all of our allies, including Israel, to account for following international law. I think there's a need to have a real conversation down the road, hopefully after this horrible conflict comes to as rapid of an end as it can, and I hope we can talk more about that in a minute. I do think there's a need for us to look at whether or not the enforcement mechanisms that we have had for aid are actually effective, and if not, why. But I think that is a conversation that is best held in general, looking across the world at all of the aid that we provide, because I think, sadly, that some of the concerns that people have about whether our weapons, our U.S. military assistance, is being used to further the cause of peace or to worsen it, whether it's being used to keep people safe or to put them in danger, we should not kid ourselves or sort of be blind to the reality that that is not just a challenge in the Middle East, is a challenge in many, many parts of the world where we provide military assistance.
Well, so you said now might not be the right moment. So when would be the right moment? Do you mean that after these general discussions are had?
Well, I think that the right moment would be to focus on a generalized policy. So the bill that is sort of, as I understand it, in the Senate right now is one that it's focused uniquely on aid to Israel. I think a better way to approach this, I don't think there should be any exceptions, period. And so I would be more interested in a bill that applied uniformly across all military aid and strengthened those safeguards. So I guess that's a little bit about the moment in time, but it's more about making sure that we are doing this globally. This will not be, sadly, the only horrible, painful, heart-wrenching conflict that we are in. We have already faced some of these questions in other areas and continue to. And so I think this is something that we need to address sort of uniformly across the board and make clear that our principles are principles. They're not about any particular conflict, but they are about how we lead in the world, and our standing and our moral voice on human rights is going to be weakened if we don't really do the work that we promised we're going to do when we give this aid to any country.
Thank you. I'm going to shift now to another part of deal making. Do you support the bipartisan deal that came before Congress and in regards to immigration and the border?
No, I do not. That so-called immigration deal was not the right policy for California, not the right policy for the economy, and not the right policy for us in terms of our role worldwide. Look, everyone I talk to says the same thing. They want an immigration system that is orderly. They want one that is lawful. They want an immigration system that doesn't unduly tax border communities and communities where we're seeing migrants being bussed and literally dumped without resources. But the answer to getting there is to really address the immigration challenges that our system faces. Look, I represent Orange County. Immigration is a very tough issue there. And one of the things that people will often say to me is, including a lot of immigrants, is I waited in line. I waited my turn. I think others should have to take a turn, use the lawful, orderly process. Well, let's be clear and honest with the American people. Under Title 42 with Donald Trump, and this continued into Biden's presidency, there was no line. You can't wait your turn if there literally is no no line to get in. And so I think that is Congress's job, is to create that kind of system. So I do support making sure that we have enough immigration judges. I think the Biden's effort to try to have people apply via an app, it's got its operational challenges, but I think it's at least an effort to try to create some order on a process that has become difficult. But I don't think we can fundamentally back away from hundreds of years of commitments of being a beacon of a place where people fleeing persecution can come for a better life, simply because career politicians in Washington for 30 years have punted on immigration reform. I'm 50 years old. In 1996. That was when I was in college. That was when the punitive immigration bill was passed, and we haven't gone back and addressed that and fixed the many, many challenges that it creates. So I don't think what the Senate was, and by the way, it wasn't the Senate, it was really a couple members of the Senate were trying to do was the right approach at all. I do think we also, by the way, need to focus on lawful ports of entry, not just on unlawful crossings, because most of the fentanyl, most of the guns that are being trafficked, most of the humans that are being trafficked are actually coming through authorized border crossings, airports, land crossings. And so I've gone and seen some of that technology that I voted to fund to help address those issues.
Sorry,
Yeah.
real quick. Was Biden wrong then to endorse that deal? I mean, this is a result of, negotiations with the Biden administration as well, right?
Well, I think I will tell you that I would have voted no. I also, part of my concern about it, which I spoke about publicly, is I think trying to lever one thing to deliver another is a wrong-headed approach to democracy. And we see this way too often, these mega bills, that they have something in it that someone can't vote, that everybody can't vote against, and they wind up getting over the finish line. We should have an up and down vote on foreign aid. We should have an up and down vote on immigration policy. But I think the president was really, in his role, he's not in Congress, he isn't the one taking the votes, was trying to put something in front of the Senate for a vote. But I would have much preferred that they be individual, because as you've heard me say, I would support that foreign military assistance package, including much needed humanitarian aid, but I would vote no on immigration. And I think in our democracy, we should have the ability to have bills that people can actually understand why we took the vote we took.
And President Biden had also said that if given the authority, he was prepared to shut down the U.S. border, the southern U.S. border. Do you think he would be right or wrong to do so?
I think that would be wrong to do. Look, I've also taken the time to travel a couple of times in the last year or two over into Mexico, and to see what is happening on the other side of the border. We can't be blind to the consequences of our policy decisions on our neighbors. And the reality is, policies that completely shut the border, that eliminate any ability for anyone to seek humanitarian parole or asylum, they end up keeping and trapping the most vulnerable migrants, often women, pregnant people, children, people with disabilities, in unsafe situations on the other side of the border. And the young, the fit, the healthy, frankly, men, they make unlawful crossings, often risking their lives and putting our own U.S. border protection folks in danger in taking these kinds of dangerous crossings. So we need to have a policy that helps the most vulnerable in the most need of protection be able to have their cases prioritized and heard, and a complete shutdown of the border, and we saw this during Title 42, actually does the opposite.
Yeah, well, I know we do need to move on to other topics, but the last question on this. So you talked a little bit about, a lack of clear pathways to citizenship. Which pathways do you support? And, do you think it's time for another broad amnesty for undocumented immigrants that are already in the U.S.?
Yeah, I do support updating the year of admission so that we could basically say, if you've been living here in the United States, following our laws, working, paying taxes, doing everything that we expect a great American to do, and you've been doing that for 7 years, you ought to have the opportunity to become a citizen. We've had a broken immigration system for much longer than that. And so I think we do need a reset. And this was an idea that Reagan championed. It's really an idea about being able to solve this problem rather than getting more mired in it. And I do think that what we've done with our immigration system in part is to complicate it so much that effectively people can't navigate it. And those who have a lawyer, those who have means, those who can get certain kinds of visas are able to successfully come to the United States, and the most vulnerable are not. I also think the challenges of mixed status families are excruciating. People who are unable to, one member maybe isn't documented, one is, one's on the pathway to citizenship, one isn't. One of the facts that I like to give people when we talk about this is that last year, only 3% of people who applied for a green card got one. So this gives some real sense of how impossible it is under the current system to actually navigate to citizenship. It's not for a want of becoming citizens, it's for the lack of there being a legal opportunity to do so. So I think we have to make the system less complicated, quit dividing and pitting different kinds of immigrants against each other, and have more broad-based opportunity to come to this country. There will always be more people in the history of the United States who have wanted to come here than we have necessarily accommodated, but we have to do that in a way that is, I think, less bureaucratic, less administratively complicated and expensive, less slow. And if we do those things, I think that will help us have a more humane and orderly immigration system.
Okay, I'm going to try and be really quick here, so I apologize. I'm sure you have great answers for all my questions, but I think one of the things that is getting a lot of political attention in California is this anxiety over rising crime, whether that matches with the actual data or not. So what is one specific policy that you would propose to address those concerns about crime?
Yeah, I think that Governor Newsom's package of bills on retail theft is actually helpful. I think we need to think about how we can address some of the transnational and kind of organized crime that is going on, rather than simply looking one by one. We have to look at this as a pattern, and I think that's what we're seeing. There are a lot of proven solutions to some of this that we're not always investing in. So one of the things I have championed in the House, it passed the House last Congress on a bipartisan basis, was a Mental Health Justice Act that would allow cities and counties to have dedicated mental health first responders. That would greatly free up our police, who are normally sent into these situations where they themselves will tell you, even with more training, this is not their professional mission, it is not their duty. And so I think it's partly about making sure that we're not diverting our law enforcement officers into mental health response, into homelessness response, but instead they're focused squarely on solving crime. I do think additional resources are helpful, whether that's National Guard, whether that's the federal government. One of the things I've also focused on the Oversight Committee is fentanyl and the role of Chinese money laundering organizations working in conjunction with Mexican cartels in order to facilitate fentanyl. That is a sophisticated and complicated challenge, and it's one that we're going to need federal resources to be able to address. That's not something we can put on local law enforcement, who are going to be in the position of dealing with fentanyl when it finally arrives on the street. But to back that problem up and solve it at a more structural level is going to take federal resources.
So on that enforcement side, are there any crimes for which you would actually support increasing punishment at this time?
I don't think we should go backwards on this. I think what we've seen is that our incarceration system has become a source of profit for huge Fortune 500 companies. It is not an effective system at actually rehabilitating people and preventing recidivism. So I do think we ought to be focusing first and foremost on crime prevention and on violence reduction, including working to limit the firearms and the weapons that are on the street. I absolutely absolutely. As a mom of 3 kids, and as someone who travels around the state, often late at night and often alone as I'm navigating to and from events and hotels, I think it's important to understand people have their concerns and their anxieties are very real. And so government needs to not dismiss them out of hand, and they need to listen to them. They need to provide data, as you point out. The degree to which this is a perception versus a reality problem is a complicated thing. But there's no doubt that the government needs to fully own its obligation to make people, have people be safe in their community and to communicate those policies in a way that helps them feel safe.
Okay, and I'm sorry, I have to completely switch gears now, unfortunately, but California, one of its biggest climate policies that it's working on right now is to get every driver buying zero emission vehicles by 2035. Is that a policy that the United States should be pursuing federally as a way to address transportation emissions?
California should not be having to go at it alone in terms of acting on climate. And I think we've had to do that too often. California taxpayers, California families have had to bear the brunt of addressing climate as the federal government has long lagged behind. I think this is potentially another example of that. I will say I want to make sure that as this policy rolls out, that we are fully cognizant of all of the equity issues that we face here. Look, the highest emissions come from the oldest vehicles, often driven by working class or minimum wage workers who have the longest commutes. So helping someone get a Tesla that they drive 1 mile from work to their condo is not nearly the climate solution as taking off a 25-year-old Honda that's being driven 75 or 90 miles each way each day from the Central Valley into the Bay Area or from Riverside, Corona into Orange County, for example. So I do want to make sure that, and I think this is where the federal government's role really can come, making sure that we are pushing for and backstopping the production of electric vehicles that are affordable, dollar for dollar, gallon for gallon, like people, and the electrification that goes with it. One of the reasons that I know a lot of people don't buy electric vehicles, and I know people personally who have gotten rid of their electric vehicles because they live in apartment buildings, because they live in places where they do not have a garage to put in that charging station. And so we can't put responsibilities just on people to make this change. We have to make the structural change around it in manufacturing and cost and electrification accessibility to go with it. And I do think the federal government should be a partner to California in this.
Now, last thing, in your questionnaire to us, you talked about wanting to eliminate tax breaks and sweetheart deals for polluters as a way to address climate change. Could you just quickly give us a few examples of specific tax breaks or deals that you think need to be eliminated to address?
Yeah, there's a bill on this that I'm a co-lead on with Sean Kasten and Earl Blumenauer. And one of the examples is we give oil and gas companies different rules on depreciation than we give other companies. That's a great, easy example. Basically, the tax policies are written to allow and to sort of benefit oil and gas companies engaging in speculative purchases, speculative leasing, and that is something that we need to reverse. And so that we need to be making sure that our tax policy is pushing our economy in the direction where it needs to be in the future, not incentivizing things to remain the same.
Thank you. I think Stella has a closing question, so thanks so much.
Hey, thank you so much. So, if you don't finish in the top 2 and it's 2 Democrats advancing to November, do you plan to endorse one?
So I am going to be finishing in the top 2. So I don't know what to tell you about that, Stella, except that I will say that you followed this race very closely. You have seen the polling over the entirety of this race. It is a very, very close race. And it is a close race, a close 3-way race, I should add, between me, Adam Schiff, and Steve Garvey. And so we will see what happens on March 5th. But of course, I want a Democrat to represent me. I'm someone who cares deeply and fiercely about things like abortion rights, gun violence prevention, and so labor rights. I'm definitely going to be voting for and supporting a Democrat, and I'm very much looking forward to voting for myself in November, as well as having my 18-year-old who's a first-time voter is going to be voting for me as well. And let me tell you, that took a little work. He's 18. You got to persuade those voters.
Awesome. And hey, real quick, one question, you haven't exactly seen eye to eye to the Democratic establishment. Some of them are, so-called career politicians that you have attacked over the years. If you are elected to the Senate and you must work with those people that you have criticized, how would you get along with them? Would it cost you the legislation you want to approve?
Yeah. I have amazing relationships with my colleagues, and I'll just give you the proof points. Last Congress, I was elected to serve as the number 2, the deputy chair of the Congressional Progressive Caucus, and last Congress, that was the largest Democratic caucus in the House, and that's a mark of the respect that my colleagues have for me. I've been twice now in 2 consecutive Congresses chosen to be subcommittee chair, right? Well, once a chair and once a ranking member, because we were in the majority and minority of the committees that I serve on. And I have shown time and time again, I think, a remarkable ability to find bipartisan support for my bills and for my projects. So my Vote by Mail Tracking Act, for example, last week passed the House Oversight Committee 44-0. And that is an even better, that is amazing, given this is the committee that is involved in some of the most partisan activity in this Congress. And so these relationships are forged on respect. They are forged on the ability of someone to get things done, and on people's ability to keep their word. And I think that is what's going to allow me in the Senate, particularly where there are more one-on-one relationships that are built that way, to be very, very effective at fighting for California.